The laugh came from the other side of my yard. Not loud, not angry, just a quick little laugh that carried over the broken fence like a whisper meant to sting. I was standing there with a hammer in my hand, staring at the loose boards leaning sideways like tired bones. The wind had knocked the fence down during the night. It was old wood. The posts had been sinking for years. Nothing dramatic. Still, the laugh stopped me. I looked up. My neighbor stood by their mailbox watching me. 50 years of living teaches a person something about laughter. Some laughter is friendly. Some is nervous. This one carried judgment. "Looks like your fence gave up," my neighbor said. I nodded slowly. "Wood does that after a while." Another laugh. Slightly longer this time. "You might want to fix it soon. Would not want things crossing the line." The words hung in the air. Crossing the line. At that moment, I thought they were talking about stray dogs or wandering kids. I had no idea they meant something else entirely. I turned back to the broken boards and kept working. I had lived in that house for almost 3 decades. Raised my child there. Buried a spouse who had loved planting roses along that same fence line. A loose fence was just a weekend chore. Nothing more. At least that is what I believed that morning. Half an hour later, I noticed my neighbor still watching. Not helping. Not leaving. Just watching. That strange feeling started creeping into my chest. A quiet pressure that said something about the moment was not normal. I kept hammering anyway. 3 nails later, my neighbor called out again. "You know," they said, "you might want to check the property line before fixing that." I paused. The hammer froze in my hand. "Why would I need to do that?" I asked. My neighbor shrugged like the question meant nothing. "Oh, just something I heard." Heard from who? The thought slipped into my mind and stayed there. But I did not ask. Instead, I drove the nail down hard enough to split the wood. That little crack felt louder than it should have. My neighbor laughed again, then walked away. I wish the story ended there. But 3 days later, the letter arrived. A thick white envelope sat inside my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a folded legal notice. The words were stiff and cold. "Property boundary dispute." My eyes moved across the paper slowly. According to the document, a section of land behind my house might legally belong to the neighbor next door. The same neighbor who laughed at my broken fence. I read the page 3 times. The survey they mentioned was older than my time in the house. It claimed the original boundary line had been recorded incorrectly, which meant something impossible. My fence might be sitting inside their property. I walked outside immediately. The broken boards still leaned against the post where I had left them. The wind pushed one plank forward like it was pointing somewhere. Right toward the neighbor's yard. I stood there trying to make sense of the paper in my hand. 30 years. 3 decades of mowing the same grass. Planting the same roses. Repairing the same fence. And suddenly someone claimed the land was not mine. That night, I barely slept. By morning, I decided to walk next door. If a problem existed, it needed to be handled like adults. My neighbor opened the door quickly. Too quickly. Almost like they had been waiting. "Morning," they said with a smile that did not reach their eyes. I held up the letter. "Did you know anything about this?" They glanced at the paper and nodded casually. "Oh yes. Survey issue. Survey issue." Such simple words for something that threatened to erase decades of life. "You sent this?" I asked. My neighbor shook their head. No. Lawyers handle that sort of thing. Lawyers." The word landed like a stone in my stomach. The smile returned. "You know, it might be easier if we just fixed the paperwork quietly." "What paperwork?" "A simple document confirming the land belongs on our side." My fingers tightened. "Around the letter. And if I do not sign it?" The neighbor leaned against the doorframe like the answer amused them. "Well, then things could become complicated." Complicated. Another small word with heavy weight. I looked past them into their house. Boxes stacked along the hallway. Real estate brochures on the table. That was when the pieces started shifting in my mind. Something bigger was happening. Something connected to that land behind my fence. My neighbor followed my gaze and quickly stepped in front of the doorway. "Look," they said softly. "No need to turn this into a fight." Then came the strangest part of the entire conversation. The same neighbor who laughed at my broken fence lowered their voice and said something unexpected. "I might actually need your help soon." The word stunned me. "Help? After sending legal threats?" "What kind of help?" I asked. They hesitated. For just a second. Long enough for doubt to appear in their eyes. "You will understand later," they said. Then the door closed. Just like that. No explanation. No apology. Just silence. I walked back to my yard slowly. The broken fence waited exactly where I had left it. The boards leaned against the post like witnesses. And that was when I noticed something new. Bright orange paint on the grass. A thin line stretching along the ground. Survey markings. Someone had measured the land while I slept. The line cut directly through my yard. Through the rose garden. Through the fence. Through 30 years of memories. I stood there staring at it while the wind pushed one of the broken boards flat against the ground. The sound echoed through the quiet morning. And a strange thought formed in my mind. That laugh from my neighbor had not been about a broken fence. It had been about something much bigger. Something they believed they had already won. What they did not know yet was this. I had no intention of giving up that land. Even if it meant stepping into a courtroom. Even if it meant exposing the secret my neighbor was hiding. Because the truth behind that orange line in my yard was darker than a simple property dispute. And soon the same neighbor who laughed at my broken fence would return to my door. Not to laugh, but to beg for help. The letter stayed on my kitchen table the entire night. I kept walking past it like it might change its words when I looked away. It never did. The orange survey line outside my window felt like it was burning through the yard, even though I could not see it in the dark. Sleep did not visit my house that night. Memories did. Every creak of the floor reminded me of the years inside those walls. I remembered carrying furniture through the front door when the house was still new to me. I remembered my child learning to ride a bicycle along the driveway. I remembered my spouse planting those roses along the fence and laughing when the thorns caught our sleeves. All of it sat on land someone now claimed did not belong to me. Morning came with a strange quiet. No birds. No lawn mowers. Just silence pressing against the windows. I stepped outside with the letter still in my hand. The orange paint was still there. A thin scar running across my yard. It started near the back corner and sliced straight through the rose garden before disappearing toward the broken fence. Someone had placed small wooden stakes every few feet, like tiny flags marking territory. I knelt beside one. A number had been written on it in black marker. Survey reference. Someone had planned this carefully. The wind moved the loose fence board again, tapping the ground softly. That sound carried me back to the moment my neighbor laughed. That laugh did not feel random anymore. It felt prepared. I stood and walked slowly toward the fence line. The neighbor's house sat quiet on the other side, but their curtains were open. A shadow moved behind the glass for a second. They were watching again. I pretended not to notice. Instead, I pulled one of the orange stakes out of the ground. The soil came loose easily. Fresh work. The hole it left behind looked like a wound. I dropped the stake beside the broken boards and turned toward the house. That was when I saw the truck. A white pickup rolled slowly down the street and stopped near my driveway. Two men stepped out carrying measuring equipment. One of them unfolded a tripod while the other opened a clipboard. They did not knock. They walked straight toward the orange line. I met them halfway across the yard. "What are you doing?" I asked. The taller man glanced up briefly. "Survey confirmation. On my property." He looked back at the clipboard. "Disputed property." The words landed harder than the legal notice. I folded my arms. No one asked permission. The shorter man finally spoke. "We were hired by the neighbor." Of course they were. I looked toward the house next door again. The curtain moved slightly. Still watching. I stepped directly onto the orange line. No measuring today. The two men exchanged a look that suggested they had seen this situation before. The tall one sighed. "You should talk to your lawyer." "My lawyer." He nodded toward the clipboard. "There is already a filing in motion." That sentence tightened something inside my chest. I had received a letter, but apparently the process had already begun. Without warning, without conversation, without honesty. The men packed their equipment slowly while I stood there. Before leaving, the shorter one handed me a folded paper. "Just so you know what you are dealing with." The truck drove away, leaving tire tracks in the dust. I opened the paper. A copy of a property map filled the page. Lines, numbers, coordinates. My fence sat directly across the boundary line they claimed. According to that map, part of my yard belonged to the neighbor. But something felt wrong. The dates printed in the corner showed the survey had been updated recently. Very recently. I walked back inside and spread the map across the kitchen table next to the legal notice. Then I noticed something strange. The measurements did not match the original property records I remembered from when I bought the house. I still kept those documents stored in a metal box in the closet. It took me 15 minutes to find them. The old survey map looked different. Very different. The boundary line sat several feet further away from the fence. which meant the land had always been mine. Someone had moved the line. That realization made my hands go cold. Changing a survey map was not a small mistake. It meant someone wanted that land badly enough to rewrite the boundary. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. One question filled my mind. Why? My neighbor's yard was already larger than mine. They did not need a few extra feet of dirt, unless the land itself had value. I walked outside again and followed the orange line carefully. It led toward the far corner where an old tree stood beside the fence. The roots pushed against the soil, creating a small rise in the ground. Something metal glinted near the base of the tree. I brushed the dirt away with my shoe. A small steel marker sat buried in the ground. A survey pin, the original kind used decades ago. My heart started beating faster. I knelt and cleared the soil around it until the top became visible. Stamped letters. County boundary reference. This pin marked the true property corner, and it sat several feet away from the orange line. Someone had shifted the boundary markers. Deliberately. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind me. I turned. My neighbor stood near the fence, smiling again. "You found something interesting?" they asked. I stood slowly. "You moved the line." Their smile stayed perfectly calm. "Surveyors decide those things." I pointed at the metal pin. "That marker says otherwise." They stepped closer to the fence and glanced at it. Then they laughed again. The same laugh from the other morning. "You should be careful digging around like that." "Why?" Their eyes locked onto mine. "Because things are already in court." The word court echoed inside my head. "You filed a lawsuit," I said. They nodded casually. "Just protecting property rights." I held up the old survey document. "This proves the land is mine." For the first time, their expression changed. Not fear. Annoyance. "That old paperwork will not help you." "Why not?" They leaned forward against the fence. "Because the county updated the records last month." My stomach tightened. Updated. Without my knowledge. "How convenient," I said quietly. The neighbor shrugged. "Land development changes things." That phrase stopped me. Development. Their eyes flickered for half a second. Enough to reveal something. Regret. They realized they had said too much. But the damage was done. I stepped closer to the fence. "Someone wants these properties," I said slowly. Silence answered me. Then they turned away. "Good luck with the court hearing," they said while walking back toward their house. Court hearing. The words felt heavier than the legal notice. I returned inside and sat at the kitchen table again. The old survey. The new survey. The lawsuit. All of it pointed toward something larger than a fence dispute. Someone wanted that land, and my neighbor had chosen a side. The phone rang suddenly. The sound cut through the quiet like an alarm. I picked it up. A calm voice spoke. "Good afternoon. This is the county clerk's office calling regarding your property case." "My case?" "Yes. Your neighbor filed a boundary claim and requested a hearing." "When?" The answer came without hesitation. 2 weeks from today." 2 weeks. That was all the time I had before a judge decided the fate of my land. The voice continued. "You may want legal representation." The call ended. I sat there for several minutes staring at the papers on the table. The broken fence outside suddenly felt like the smallest part of the problem, because now the fight had moved somewhere else. A courtroom, where maps could be changed, where stories could be twisted, where truth did not always win without a battle. And somewhere inside that battle was the secret my neighbor was hiding. A secret big enough to risk fraud. A secret big enough to start a lawsuit. A secret that would soon drag both of us into a conflict far uglier than a broken fence. But the strangest part had not happened yet. 3 nights later, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, the same neighbor stood there. No laughter this time. Just pale skin and shaking hands. And the words that came out of their mouth made no sense at all. "I need your help." Continued, and next the knock that night sounded different from the ones people usually make. Not firm. Not confident. 3 slow taps that carried hesitation. I opened the door expecting another argument about property lines. Instead, I saw my neighbor standing there with a face that looked 10 years older than it had that morning. The same person who laughed at my broken fence now looked like someone who had run out of air. Their hands trembled slightly. "I need your help," they said again. For a few seconds, I simply stared. A week earlier, they had filed a lawsuit that could strip part of my land away. Survey crews had marched through my yard. Orange paint still scarred the grass. Now they were asking for help. "What kind of help?" I asked. They glanced over their shoulder toward the dark street. "No one can hear this conversation." "That depends on what you are about to say." Silence stretched between us. The neighbors shifted their weight like someone deciding whether to jump from a cliff. Then they spoke. The people behind the lawsuit are not just lawyers. That sentence carried more fear than the entire legal notice. I leaned against the doorframe and waited. They want this property, the neighbor continued. Not just yours. The entire block. I already suspected something like that. But you started the case, I said. Their eyes dropped to the floor. I was pressured. The word hung there. Pressured. By who? I folded my arms. You laughed at my fence 3 days ago. They swallowed. That was before things became worse. My patience began wearing thin. If you want help, you should start explaining. They stepped inside without asking. I let them. The kitchen light made their face look pale. Sweat glistened along their forehead despite the cold night outside. Someone approached me last month, they said quietly. Who? A developer. That confirmed the suspicion already forming in my mind. What did they offer you? A lot of money. How much? They hesitated again. Enough to leave town comfortably. I leaned against the table and crossed my arms. And the condition? They wanted the houses along this side of the street. My yard sat in the center of that row. So you started a property dispute to pressure me into selling. Their shoulders slumped. Yes. The honesty came suddenly, like a dam breaking. The plan was simple. If the court ruled the land uncertain, you might decide to sell rather than fight. I felt anger rising in my chest. You tried to erase 30 years of my life for money. Their voice cracked. I did not expect it to go this far. Far. They are not patient people. That phrase made the room colder. What do you mean? They already purchased 3 houses on the next street, my neighbor whispered. The project is bigger than this block. I stayed silent, letting them talk. Yesterday they visited me, the neighbor continued. 2 men. Developers? Not exactly. Fear flickered across their face again. They made it clear the lawsuit must succeed. And if it does not, they said failure would be very unfortunate for me. The kitchen clock ticked loudly on the wall. Every second felt heavier than the last. So you came here, I said slowly. Yes. To ask the person you tried to cheat for help. Their eyes filled with something close. To shame. I know how it sounds. I studied them carefully. Fear can make people honest, but it can also make them manipulative. What exactly do you want from me? They placed a small folder on the table. Inside were documents, emails, contracts. One page carried the name of a development company I had never heard before. Another showed a payment agreement tied to the outcome of the lawsuit. But the last document made my stomach tighten. A proposed purchase contract. For my house. The price listed was far below the market value. They expected you to sell quickly once the dispute started, my neighbor said. And you agreed to help them. I thought it was just business. Business. Such an easy word for betrayal. I flipped through the papers again. One line caught my attention. A schedule. Court date. Property transfer. Construction planning. All arranged months ahead. You planned everything before the fence broke, I said quietly. The neighbor nodded. The fence falling was just coincidence. The irony twisted inside my chest. A broken piece of wood had exposed a much larger scheme. I looked back at them. So why come clean now? They sat heavily in the chair across from me. Because they are not just threatening lawsuits anymore. The air seemed to tighten around us. What happened? Their voice dropped to a whisper. They said accidents happen to stubborn people. A long silence followed. I walked to the window and looked outside. My yard lay quiet under the moonlight. The broken fence leaned against the post like it had been waiting for this entire story to unfold. You understand what you are asking me to do? I said without turning around. Yes. You want me to help you stop the people you invited into this situation. Their reply came softly. Yes. I turned back toward the table. The documents spread across it painted a picture much bigger than a simple neighbor dispute. A developer wanted the land. My neighbor had agreed to help force me out. But now fear had changed their position. Why not go to the police? I asked. They have lawyers. That does not answer the question. My neighbor rubbed their face slowly. Because the contracts I signed might also destroy me. There it was. The real reason. Fear mixed with self-preservation. You want protection, I said. Yes. And you believe exposing the truth in court will stop them. Their eyes met mine. If we show the judge the plan behind the lawsuit, the case collapses. We. Interesting word. A week ago they stood on the opposite side of the fight. Now they wanted to stand beside me. I tapped the folder with my finger. You understand the risk. They already made the risk clear. And what happens after the court hearing? They shook their head. I do not know. The honesty in that answer felt real. I walked back to the table and closed the folder. You tried to steal my land. I know. You laughed while doing it. I regret that. Regret. Another small word. But sometimes regret is the only doorway left. I looked at the clock. The court hearing was now 11 days away. 11 days to untangle a conspiracy involving contracts, developers, and a manipulated survey. You will testify, I said. They nodded quickly. You will show the judge every document. Yes. And you will admit the lawsuit was planned. Their voice trembled. Yes. That confession alone could destroy their reputation in this town. But it might also destroy the developer's plan. I pushed the folder back toward them. Bring everything you have. Their eyes widened. Does that mean you will help? I held their gaze for several seconds before answering. Yes. Relief flooded their face so quickly it almost looked painful. But I raised one finger. This is not about saving you. I understand. This is about protecting my home. They nodded again. I know. The conversation ended there. My neighbor stood slowly and walked toward the door. Before leaving, they paused. There is something else you should know. What? The developer hired the same legal team representing me. That does not surprise me. They expect to win. I opened the door and let the cool night air enter the house. Then they are going to be very disappointed. My neighbor stepped outside and disappeared into the darkness. I closed the door and locked it. The house felt different now. Heavier. Like the walls themselves knew the fight ahead would not be simple. The documents still sat on the kitchen table. Evidence of manipulation. Evidence of greed. Evidence that the broken fence had uncovered something much deeper than property lines. But one thought refused to leave my mind. If the developer believed victory was certain, it meant they had prepared more than just a lawsuit. They had prepared a strategy designed to crush anyone who resisted, which meant the courtroom would not be a fair battlefield. And somewhere inside that strategy was a move I had not seen yet, a move powerful enough to threaten everything I owned. The strange part was this. That move would reveal itself much sooner than expected, because 2 mornings later another letter arrived. Not from the court, not from the developer, but from a bank. And the message inside it changed the entire fight. The envelope looked ordinary. White paper, blue logo, a local bank I had never used. Still, something about it made my hands hesitate before opening it. Perhaps it was the timing. Perhaps it was the feeling growing in my chest that the conflict was spreading beyond the fence, beyond the neighbor, beyond the courtroom. I opened it slowly. The letter inside carried only a few sentences. Each one struck harder than the last. Notice of default. Property collateral review. For a moment, I thought the letter had been delivered to the wrong house. I read it again. Then again. The words still refused to make sense. According to the bank, my property had been listed as collateral on a financial agreement. A loan agreement. A loan I had never signed. My fingers tightened around the paper. 30 years of ownership. Every payment finished long ago. No debts attached to this house. And yet the letter clearly stated that my property stood connected to a loan currently under investigation. I walked to the cabinet and pulled out the metal box again. Inside rested every document related to the house. Purchase agreement, mortgage records, final payment receipt. All of them confirmed the same truth. The house belonged entirely to me. No bank, no lender, no debt. Yet the letter claimed something completely different. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the words until a single thought formed in my mind. Someone had tried to attach my house to a loan, without my knowledge. The question was simple. How? I turned the page over. At the bottom sat a reference number and a contact extension. I picked up the phone and dialed. 3 rings. A calm voice answered. Loan Services Department. My name is listed on a default notice you sent this morning, I said. May I have the reference number? I read it aloud. Typing sounds followed. Then silence. Long silence. Finally, the voice returned. Yes, that file exists. I never took a loan. Another pause. I understand. Then explain why my property appears in your records. More typing. More hesitation. Then the voice lowered slightly. This file was attached through a development financing package. That phrase sounded familiar. Development. The same word my neighbor accidentally mentioned. Who filed it? I asked. I cannot provide names over the phone. Then tell me something. What would you like to know? I leaned forward slowly. Was the application recent? Another pause. Yes. How recent? 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. The same time my neighbor said the developer approached them. My pulse began beating harder. So someone tried to attach my property to a loan for development, I said quietly. That appears correct. And the bank approved this? Not exactly. The answer came carefully. The file triggered a review process. Relief flickered through my chest. So the loan is not finalized. No, then why send a default notice? The voice on the other end exhaled slowly. Because the file listed your property as secured collateral. That sentence felt like a hammer. Someone had attempted to use my land as financial leverage. Without permission. Without signature. Without legal ownership. I gripped the phone tighter. Is that legal? No, then why does the file exist? The voice lowered further. Because someone submitted documentation claiming partial property rights. The room suddenly felt smaller. Partial property rights. Exactly what the lawsuit aimed to establish. The developer was not just trying to push me out. They were trying to use my land to fund their entire project. And the lawsuit would create the legal excuse they needed. My neighbor's voice echoed in my mind. They expect to win. Now I understood why. If the court believed the property boundary was uncertain, developers could treat the land as contested collateral. Banks sometimes accepted such filings temporarily during development negotiations. A technical loophole. A dangerous one. Who submitted the documents? I asked again. I cannot reveal that. But you know. Yes. I leaned back in the chair. That means the developer already started financing construction. I cannot comment on that. You already did. Silence filled the phone line again. Then the voice spoke carefully. If you believe the collateral listing is fraudulent, you may file a dispute. How long would that take? Several weeks. Weeks. The court hearing was only days away. They knew that. Whoever created this plan had thought through every step. Win the boundary case. Secure the financing. Acquire the properties. Begin construction. By the time anyone fought back, the project would already exist. I hung up slowly. The letter remained on the table. The lawsuit had felt like a neighbor dispute. But now the truth stood clear. The fence. The survey. The court hearing. The loan file. All of it belonged to a single plan. And my house sat directly in the center of it. Footsteps outside interrupted my thoughts. I looked through the window. My neighbor stood in their yard again, watching. This time their expression carried tension. I walked outside holding the bank letter. They noticed it immediately. You received it, they said. You knew this would happen. Their shoulders dropped. Yes. Anger rose quickly in my chest. You did not mention the bank. I only learned about it yesterday. That is convenient. It terrified me. Their voice cracked again. The developer used the lawsuit to attach your land to the loan application. I already figured that out. They expect the judge to rule quickly. And once the boundary shifts, I said slowly, the land becomes theirs to finance. They nodded. You understand the danger now. The wind moved through the broken fence again. Boards creaked softly. The same fence that started this entire chain of events. My neighbor looked at it for a moment. Then they spoke quietly. They will not stop if they lose the case. What do you mean? The land is too valuable. How valuable? My neighbor hesitated, then answered. Enough to build an entire commercial plaza. That sentence explained everything. A plaza meant stores, parking lots, heavy traffic. Our quiet street would disappear, and my home would vanish with it. I folded the bank letter slowly. The court hearing just became much bigger. Yes, my neighbor whispered. And you are still willing to testify? They nodded without hesitation. I will tell the judge everything. The determination in their voice felt different from the fear earlier. Guilt had finally become stronger than greed. But the situation had already grown complicated. Because the developer now had money involved. And money tends to protect itself. I looked back at the orange survey line stretching across my yard. You understand what happens if they realize you turned against them. My neighbor's face turned pale again. They already suspect. How? I stopped answering their calls. That was enough. Powerful people rarely tolerate disobedience. Then we do not have much time, I said. My neighbor stared toward the street nervously. They will try something before the hearing. What kind of something? I do not know. But the fear in their eyes suggested they imagined many possibilities. I walked back toward the house. The legal fight had just transformed into something much larger. Fraud, financial manipulation, land acquisition, and a courtroom battle that could expose all of it. But as I reached the door, another thought crossed my mind. If the developer already used my land in their financing plan, it meant one disturbing truth. They believed the judge would rule in their favor, which meant they might possess something stronger than a manipulated survey, something powerful enough to convince a court. And if that evidence existed, it would appear very soon. Because 5 days before the hearing, another surprise arrived. This time not in the mail, but in the form of a man standing at my gate, holding a folder, and a smile that felt far more dangerous than my neighbor's laugh ever did. The man at my gate stood perfectly still, not nervous, not impatient, just waiting like someone who already knew I would step outside. The morning sun sat low over the street. Light reflected off the folder in his hands. When I walked closer, he smiled. It was the kind of smile people wear when they already believe the outcome belongs to them. "Good morning," he said calmly. His voice carried a quiet confidence that immediately made my guard rise. "I believe you are the homeowner." "That depends on who is asking," I replied. He stepped forward and extended his hand, though I did not take it. "My name is Daniel Mercer, legal representative for the development group currently involved in the property matter next door." Legal representative, not the neighbor's lawyer, the developer's lawyer. The air between us tightened. "You walked onto my property," I said. "I remained outside your gate," he corrected gently. A small detail, but one that revealed how carefully he chose his actions. Lawyers tend to measure every step. "What do you want?" I asked. He lifted the folder slightly. "A conversation. I already have one scheduled in court. That hearing will be unpleasant for everyone involved. I suspect that is why you are here." The smile remained fixed on his face. "Yes." The wind shifted, brushing against the broken fence behind me. The boards creaked softly like they were listening. Mr. Mercer opened the folder slowly. Inside were several documents neatly arranged. He removed the top sheet and held it toward me. "I thought you might want to see this before the judge does." I took the paper. At first glance, it looked like a legal agreement. A property adjustment record, dated 12 years ago. My eyes moved across the page carefully, then stopped. My name appeared near the bottom. Signed, or at least something that looked like my signature. The document claimed I had agreed to a minor boundary modification with the previous owner of the neighboring house. A modification that shifted the property line several feet inward, exactly where the orange survey line now sat. My chest tightened. "I never signed this." Mr. Mercer tilted his head slightly. "That will be an interesting argument in court." The calm tone irritated me more than if he had been aggressive. "This is forged," I said. "Perhaps." "You know it is." "Possibly." I looked closer at the signature. At first glance, it resembled my handwriting. But something about the shape of the letters felt wrong. Too stiff. Too careful. A good imitation, but still an imitation. "When did you obtain this?" I asked. "Recently." "From where?" "A records archive." That answer told me nothing. I handed the paper back. "You expect a judge to believe that?" Mr. Mercer slid the document back into the folder. "It aligns nicely with the updated survey." "The survey was manipulated." "That is your opinion." "It is the truth." He smiled again. "In court, truth and evidence are not always the same thing." That sentence carried quiet menace. The developer had prepared more than a simple lawsuit. They had prepared documents. Old ones. Convincing ones. And if the judge believed them, the boundary dispute would be settled instantly. "You forged my signature," I said. Mr. Mercer did not react. "You are free to claim that." "I will prove it." "That would require expert analysis." "I will get it." "That might take time." The word time echoed in my mind. Time the court schedule did not allow. The hearing was only 5 days away. Mr. Mercer closed the folder. "I came here as a courtesy." "A courtesy?" "Yes. To give you an opportunity to settle." The word settle carried weight. "How generous." "The development group is willing to purchase your property immediately." "For how much?" He named a number, even lower than the amount listed in the documents my neighbor showed me. An insult disguised as an offer. "That will not happen," I said. He shrugged lightly. "Then the court will decide." I crossed my arms. "You already think the court belongs to you." Mr. Mercer's smile grew slightly. "I believe the evidence supports our position. Evidence created by your client. That accusation will require proof." The conversation had become a slow chess match. Each word placed carefully, each move testing the other side. But one thing bothered me. If the developer felt so confident, why come here personally? Lawyers rarely waste time on hopeless negotiations. You did not come just to show me a document, I said. Mr. Mercer studied my face quietly. Then his expression shifted slightly. A hint of respect appeared in his eyes. You are perceptive. Then tell me the real reason. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke. The neighbor. My attention sharpened instantly. What about them? They visited your house recently. The statement was not a question. They already knew. That is none of your concern, I said. Mr. Mercer's smile disappeared for the first time. It becomes my concern if they plan to testify. My neighbor had been right. The developer suspected betrayal. You seem worried, I said. Not worried. Then why mention it? He leaned slightly closer to the gate. Because people sometimes change their minds. I doubt it. Money can help them remember their original agreement. So that was the angle. A warning disguised as negotiation. You plan to buy their silence, I said. People appreciate financial stability. I studied his face carefully. Behind the calm expression sat something colder. Control. Confidence built on power. You are afraid they will expose the contracts, I said. His eyes narrowed slightly. Be careful with accusations. Truth does not require permission. The wind rattled the loose fence boards again. The sound filled the pause between us. Mr. Mercer straightened his jacket. The hearing will happen soon. I am aware. You may want to reconsider your position. I already have. And I will see you in court. The lawyer nodded slowly. Very well. He turned toward the street, then paused. One more thing. What? The development group does not like delays. That sounds like their problem. He looked back at the house behind me, at the fence, at the yard. At some point, he said quietly, every property owner must decide how much a piece of land is worth. I already decided that 30 years ago. And if the situation becomes uncomfortable, I have lived through worse. Mr. Mercer held my gaze for a moment longer. Then he walked away. His car disappeared at the end of the street. The quiet that followed felt heavier than before, because now the fight had clear shape. The developer had money, lawyers, documents, influence, and possibly forged evidence strong enough to fool a judge. But they had one weakness. My neighbor. The person who helped build their case. The person now ready to tear it apart. I turned toward the house slowly. The courtroom battle would arrive in 5 days. 5 days to prepare. 5 days to prove that signature was fake. 5 days to expose a scheme designed to steal an entire street. But fate had another twist waiting. Because that same evening my neighbor came running across the yard. Not walking, running, panic on their face. And the first words they shouted changed everything again. They know I came to you. My neighbor ran across the yard like someone chased by something invisible. The panic on their face made it clear this was not exaggeration. They know I came to you. They said again, breath shaking. The words landed harder than the legal threats from the developer's lawyer earlier that morning. How? I asked. I do not know. They kept glancing toward the street, like someone expected a car to appear at any moment. Slow down, I said. But slowing down did not seem possible for them. They called me. The neighbor continued. About an hour ago. The developer? Yes. What did they say? Their voice dropped. They asked why I visited your house. The question alone carried a thread inside it. And what did you tell them? I said it was about the fence. The neighbor laughed nervously. A thin, broken sound. They did not believe me. That did not surprise me. The lawyer had already hinted they suspected betrayal. What happened next? I asked. They told me something strange. What? They said people who interfere with development projects usually regret it. The wind pushed against the broken fence behind us again. Boards creaked softly. The same sound that had followed every major moment in this story. My neighbor rubbed their hands together. They know about the documents. They assume you still have them? Yes. You do not. Their eyes moved toward my house. No. That answer took a second to register. Then I understood. You brought them here. They nodded quickly. I was afraid to keep them. Smart decision. If the developer suspected betrayal, the first place they would search was the neighbor's house. Where are they now? I asked. In my car. The tension in my chest tightened immediately. You left evidence in your car? I did not know where else to put it. I stepped closer. Did anyone follow you here? I do not think so. Think. Not know. That uncertainty worried me. Because the people behind this development clearly planned everything carefully. And careful people rarely leave loose ends. Go get the documents, I said. My neighbor hurried back across the yard. The street remained quiet. Too quiet. 5 minutes later, they returned carrying a thick envelope. I took it inside and spread the papers across the kitchen table. Contracts, emails, payment schedules, and several pages of internal communication between the developer and their legal team. One message caught my attention immediately. It mentioned something called Phase 2 acquisition. A list of addresses followed. Every house along my side of the street, including mine. Look at the dates, I said. My neighbor leaned over the table. The emails stretched back 6 months. 6 months of planning. 6 months of preparing the lawsuit. 6 months of preparing the forged document. They started this long before the fence broke, the neighbor whispered. Yes. The fence was just an opportunity. Another email sat near the bottom of the stack. This one carried a warning written by the developer's legal team. It mentioned risk of witness reversal. In other words, they already considered the possibility that my neighbor might turn against them, which meant they probably had a backup plan. My neighbor sat down slowly. They will destroy me in court. You already destroyed their plan, I replied. That does not make them forgiving. No, it makes them desperate. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Each second brought the hearing closer. But now the stakes had grown even higher. Because the developer had more than one weapon. They had the forged signature. They had the manipulated survey. And they might also have influence inside the system. I flipped through the remaining documents carefully. Then something strange appeared. A bank communication. Not the same bank that sent my letter. A different one. This message discussed construction financing already approved, which meant the developer believed construction would start soon. Very soon. They are already moving money, I said. My neighbor stared at the page. But the court has not ruled yet. That does not stop them from preparing. The developer expected victory. Or they expected something else. Something that would make the case irrelevant. A sudden thought crossed my mind. What happens if the judge delays the case? My neighbor looked confused. Why would that happen? Procedural issues. Evidence disputes. Legal motions. Their eyes widened slowly. You think they might try to delay things? Maybe. And during the delay, they could move forward with the project. Yes. The realization made the room feel colder. Because construction equipment arriving on the street would change everything. Once construction began, stopping it would become far more difficult. Developers knew that. That was why they often moved quickly. A car door slammed outside. Both of us froze. My neighbor rushed to the window. A black sedan sat parked across the street. Neither of us recognized it. 2 people remained inside, watching. They found us, my neighbor whispered. Maybe. They might just be curious. But deep down I knew curiosity had nothing to do with it. Developers rarely send strangers to sit quietly in parked cars. My neighbor stepped back from the window. What do we do now? The question hung in the air. The obvious answer was simple. Expose everything in court. But the situation had already grown complicated. Because the developer now knew about the documents. And people who stand to lose millions of dollars rarely remain passive. I looked at the envelope again. These papers are powerful. Yes. They prove the lawsuit was planned. Yes. And they prove the developer tried to manipulate the bank. My neighbor nodded slowly. But that also makes them dangerous. Exactly. Evidence can protect you, but it can also make you a target. The car outside remained parked. Still watching. Still waiting. My neighbor paced across the kitchen. They might try to take the documents. They might. They might try something worse. Possibly. Fear filled their voice again. I made a terrible mistake. Yes. But mistakes can still be corrected. How? By finishing what you started. They stopped pacing. You mean testifying? Yes. Their hands shook slightly. If I speak in court, they will know I betrayed them. They already know. Silence filled the room again. The neighbor looked toward the envelope, then toward the window, then back at me. Finally they spoke. I will testify. The words sounded fragile, but they carried determination underneath. That might not be enough, I said. What else do we need? Proof that the signature on that document is fake. My neighbor thought for a moment. Then their expression changed. I might know someone. Who? A retired survey officer. What can they do? They handled property records for this county for 20 years. That sounded promising. They might recognize the document, the neighbor added. Or recognize the forgery. Hope flickered for the first time since the lawsuit began. Can you contact them? I asked. Yes. Do it tomorrow. My neighbor nodded. The black sedan outside finally started its engine. It drove slowly down the street and disappeared. But the message had already been delivered. The developer knew. The fight had become personal, and the courtroom hearing was now only 3 days away. 3 days to prove fraud. 3 days to expose a conspiracy. 3 days to protect a home that held 30 years of memories. But the biggest shock had not happened yet, because the retired survey officer my neighbor mentioned would reveal something none of us expected. Something buried in county records for decades. Something that would not just destroy the developer's case. It would expose a lie that had been hidden in this neighborhood for nearly 40 years. And when that truth came out in court, the entire room would fall silent. The morning arrived heavy with tension. Sleep had barely touched me during the night. Every sound outside the house felt sharper than usual. The memory of the black sedan sitting across the street refused to leave my mind. Whoever sat inside that car had not been there by accident. They had been watching. And when people start watching, it means the situation is already moving towards something bigger. My neighbor returned shortly after sunrise. This time they were not running, but their face still carried the same tight worry. I reached them. They said before even stepping fully into the yard. The survey officer? Yes. Did they agree to help? They want to see the document first. That made sense. Someone who worked with land records for decades would not jump into a legal conflict without evidence. Bring them here, I asked. My neighbor shook their head. They said we should come to them. Why? They do not trust visitors. I could not blame them. Anyone connected to this situation would quickly learn that trust had become a rare thing. We gathered the documents quickly. Contracts, emails, maps, and the forged signature the developer's lawyer proudly displayed yesterday. All of it went into a folder. My neighbor drove. The small house belonging to the retired survey officer sat near the edge of town. An older neighborhood where the streets remained quiet and the houses stood far apart from one another. The place looked peaceful, which made the tension in my chest feel even sharper. We knocked once. The door opened slowly. A thin older person stood there wearing reading glasses and holding a notebook. You brought the documents, they said. Their voice carried calm authority. Yes, my neighbor replied. We stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. Stacks of maps filled the shelves along the walls. Rolled survey drawings sat tied together with faded ribbon. This was clearly the home of someone who spent decades studying land lines. Show me the signature, the survey officer said. I placed the document on the table. They leaned closer and adjusted their glasses. Several seconds passed. Then their eyebrows lifted slightly. That is interesting. What is? I asked. They pointed at the signature. This handwriting tries very hard to look natural. Meaning, it was copied. My neighbor exhaled loudly. So it is fake. The survey officer nodded. Yes. Relief flickered through the room. But the older person did not look finished studying the page. They kept examining the document carefully. Then they said something unexpected. This paper is older than it claims. I frowned. The date says 12 years. Yes. But the ink does not. That caught my attention immediately. You can tell that? The survey officer smiled faintly. When you work with county documents long enough, patterns become familiar. They lifted the page closer to the window. The ink type used here did not exist in local government offices 12 years ago. My neighbor stared. So the document was created recently. Most likely. That meant the forgery had been prepared specifically for this case. But the survey officer was not finished yet. They reached for the map attached to the document. Then something strange happened. Their entire posture changed. They leaned forward quickly, eyes narrowing. Where did you get this? They asked. The developer's lawyer showed it to me, I replied. The survey officer looked at the boundary line printed on the map. Then they walked toward a shelf and pulled out an old rolled survey drawing. Dust scattered across the table as they unrolled it. This map is from the original neighborhood development, they said. What year? I asked. 40 years ago. They placed the two maps side by side. The difference appeared immediately, not just in the property line, but in something else, something far more significant. There is a missing section, the survey officer said quietly. What do you mean? My neighbor asked. They tapped the old map. This land behind your house was originally reserved. Reserved for what? The survey officer looked up slowly. A public easement. The words landed like a shock. An easement? I repeated. Yes. For utility access. I stared at the old map. The area behind my fence contained a narrow strip labeled clearly, Utility Access Corridor, which meant something very simple. The land behind my fence could never legally belong to a private developer because it was designated for public infrastructure, water lines, power access, maintenance vehicles. The developer's plan suddenly made sense. They were trying to erase that easement by shifting the property boundary through a lawsuit. If the boundary changed, the easement would disappear from the development plan. And once construction began, restoring that corridor would become nearly impossible. My neighbor leaned back in the chair. They were not just stealing land. No, the survey officer said calmly. They were trying to erase public infrastructure rights. That was far bigger than a neighbor dispute. Much bigger. Violating a public easement could bring massive legal consequences. Fines, project cancellation, even criminal investigation. The survey officer tapped the forged document again. This signature forgery was only one part of the plan. What else did they change? I asked. They studied the new survey map again, then pointed to the updated boundary coordinates. These numbers are impossible. Why? They moved the line directly through the easement corridor. My neighbor stared at the page. So they erased the corridor entirely. Yes. A long silence filled the room. The developer had not just planned a lawsuit. They had planned to rewrite the land record itself. That level of fraud carried enormous risk, which meant one thing. They expected no one to notice, or no one brave enough to challenge them. The survey officer folded their arms. This case will collapse if the judge sees this. Relief spread through my chest. For the first time since this started, I feel like we have something real. Yes, the survey officer said, but you must present it carefully. What do you mean? They will fight hard to hide this. Why? Because exposing a forged boundary is serious. How serious? The survey officer looked directly at me. Serious enough to shut down the entire development. My neighbor's eyes widened. That could cost them millions. Yes. And people who stand to lose millions rarely surrender quietly. The warning sat heavily in the room. The developer now had everything to lose. Money, reputation, the entire project, which meant the courtroom battle was about to become far more aggressive. The survey officer rolled up the old map carefully. You should make copies of this immediately. We will, I said, and bring it to court. My neighbor looked nervous again. What if the developer tries to stop us? The survey officer gave a calm answer. They probably will. The ride back home felt different. The fear remained. But now it shared space with determination. Because the truth had finally appeared. The developer had forged documents, manipulated surveys, attempted to erase a public easement, all to build their project. But the most dangerous moment was still waiting ahead. The courtroom hearing, where everything would be exposed, where the developer's lawyer would fight back with everything they had, and where one unexpected witness would walk into the courtroom and change the entire case in a way none of us predicted. The courtroom felt colder than the outside air. Not physically cold, the kind of cold created by tension and silence. The kind that sits in the room before a serious decision is made. I arrived early. The wooden benches were mostly empty. A few people whispered quietly near the back wall. The clerk sorted papers behind the judge's desk. My neighbor sat beside me, nervously rubbing their hands together. They will be here soon, they said. They always arrive at the last moment, I replied. Powerful lawyers rarely rush into courtrooms. They prefer to enter when everyone is already watching. Right on time, the door opened. Mr. Mercer walked in. Same suit, same calm smile. Behind him sat two men I had never seen before. The developers. They carried the quiet confidence of people used to winning. Mr. Mercer noticed us immediately. His eyes moved from me to my neighbor. That small glance told me something important. He knew. He knew my neighbor planned to testify. But his expression did not show concern. Only patience. Which meant he still believed the case belonged to him. The judge entered moments later. Everyone stood. The sound of chairs sliding across the floor echoed briefly before silence returned. The judge sat down and opened the case file. Property dispute hearing, the judge said. My chest tightened. 30 years of life in that house now depended on the next few hours. Mr. Mercer stood first. Your Honor, the matter before the court concerns a boundary disagreement between neighboring properties. His voice flowed smoothly through the room. The updated survey clearly shows the correct property line. He handed several documents to the clerk. The same survey map. The same forged agreement. The same signature that did not belong to me. The judge examined the pages carefully. Mr. Mercer continued speaking. The defendant signed an adjustment agreement 12 years ago. That life floated through the courtroom like smoke. I stayed calm, because now we had something stronger. The judge looked toward me. Do you dispute the agreement? Yes, I said clearly. I never signed that document. Mr. Mercer responded immediately. The signature appears consistent with other records. The judge turned toward me again. Do you have evidence supporting your claim? Yes. My neighbor stood slowly. Every pair of eyes in the room shifted toward them. Mr. Mercer's expression remained calm, but I noticed a slight tightening around his jaw. The judge spoke. Please state your name for the record. My neighbor did. Then they began speaking. Their voice trembled at first, but as the story unfolded, the room grew quieter. They explained everything. The developer's offer, the money promised, the plan to pressure me into selling, the lawsuit designed to move the boundary. Every piece of the scheme spilled into the courtroom. Mr. Mercer did not interrupt. He simply listened, which worried me, because silence from a skilled lawyer usually means they already prepared a response. When my neighbor finished, the judge leaned back in the chair. You are admitting participation in a fraudulent plan, the judge said. Yes, my neighbor replied quietly. Why come forward now? Because the plan became bigger than I expected. The judge looked at Mr. Mercer. Counsel. The lawyer stood slowly. Your Honor, emotional stories can be persuasive. He walked toward the judge's bench and placed another document down. But evidence remains the foundation of legal decisions. The clerk passed the paper to the judge. Mr. Mercer continued calmly. The agreement signed 12 years ago remains valid. He turned slightly toward me. Unless the defendant can prove otherwise. The moment had arrived. I stood and handed the old map from the retired survey officer. The judge studied it carefully. What is this? The judge asked. Original development survey from 40 years ago. And why is it relevant? Because it shows a public easement behind my property. The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. A public easement? Yes. The courtroom shifted. Even Mr. Mercer's calm posture changed slightly. I continued speaking. The developer's survey erased that easement. The judge compared the two maps. Old map. New map. Boundary line. Missing corridor. The difference was obvious. Counsel, the judge said, looking toward Mr. Mercer. Explain this discrepancy. For the first time since the hearing began, the lawyer hesitated. Only for a second, but it was enough. The updated survey reflects modern measurements, he replied. The judge looked unconvinced. That does not explain the missing easement. Silence filled the room. Then something unexpected happened. The courtroom door opened. A man walked inside carrying a worn leather folder. The clerk approached him immediately. After a short conversation, the clerk turned toward the judge. Your Honor, a witness has requested to submit historical county records. The judge nodded. Proceed. The man stepped forward. It was the retired survey officer. They placed several old documents on the bench. These are county archive records, they said, from the original neighborhood development. The judge flipped through the pages. Each one confirmed the same thing. The easement existed, and it had never been legally removed. The courtroom murmured quietly. Mr. Mercer remained silent, but the developers sitting behind him no longer looked comfortable. The judge closed the folder slowly. This changes the situation significantly. My neighbor exhaled loudly beside me. For the first time since the lawsuit began, the case felt like it might actually turn. But the judge was not finished. They looked directly at Mr. Mercer. If the easement was intentionally removed from the updated survey, this court will require an explanation. Mr. Mercer stood slowly. His calm smile had disappeared. Your Honor, I request a brief recess. The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded. 10 minutes. The courtroom erupted into quiet conversation. People whispered. Papers shuffled. But I stayed seated, watching the developer, watching their lawyer, because something about their behavior still bothered me. They looked stressed, but not defeated, which meant they still had another move prepared. 10 minutes later, the courtroom filled again. The judge returned. Mr. Mercer stood, but the confidence that once filled his voice had faded. Before he could speak, the judge raised a hand. This court has reviewed the historical records. Silence fell instantly. The easement remains legally valid. Relief rushed through my chest. But the judge's next words shocked everyone. However, the judge continued. There is another matter that must be addressed. The room went completely silent. The judge lifted a new document. This court received a motion this morning claiming the property owner may not legally own the land at all. The words hit the room like thunder. I felt my heart stop for a moment. What? I said quietly. The judge looked directly at me. According to this filing, your house may have been transferred decades ago under a different ownership agreement. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Mr. Mercer finally smiled again. A slow, confident smile. And in that moment I realized something terrifying. The developer's entire plan had not depended on the boundary line or the forged signature. Those had only been distractions. Their real strategy had been waiting quietly in the background. A claim that I might not legally own my own house. And if that claim succeeded, the entire case would collapse instantly. The courtroom went silent in a way that felt unnatural. Not the quiet of patience, the quiet of shock. I sat there staring at the judge, trying to understand the sentence that had just been spoken. You may not legally own the land at all. The words echoed in my head. 30 years in that house. 30 years paying every bill. 30 years maintaining the yard, repairing the roof, replacing the fence more times than I could remember. And now someone claimed the house might not belong to me. Mr. Mercer stood slowly. The smile on his face returned with quiet confidence. It was the expression of someone who had waited patiently for this exact moment. Your Honor, he said, the development group recently uncovered a historical ownership transfer. The judge looked down at the document again. Explain. Mr. Mercer adjusted his jacket. 40 years ago, before the neighborhood was fully built, the land was part of a cooperative housing agreement. The phrase felt unfamiliar. Cooperative housing. The judge studied the file. Continue. The original developer created a temporary trust ownership for several properties while infrastructure was completed. The courtroom listened carefully. According to the documents, Mr. Mercer continued, one parcel of land was never officially transferred out of that trust. My chest tightened. I already knew where this was going. And that parcel, the judge said slowly, is the defendant's property. Yes. The word dropped into the room like a stone. The developer sitting behind Mr. Mercer leaned back comfortably. They had been waiting for this. Waiting for the moment the case stopped being about boundaries. Because if the ownership itself came into question, the rest of the arguments would become meaningless. The judge looked at me again. Do you have records confirming the transfer? I bought the house 30 years ago, I said. Do you have the purchase documents? Yes. Submit them. My hands moved quickly through the folder. The original purchase contract. The mortgage records. The final payment certificate. Everything proving the house had been legally sold to me. The clerk carried the papers to the judge. The courtroom waited. Mr. Mercer watched quietly. His calm expression never moved, which meant he expected this moment. The judge compared the documents carefully, then looked up again. These records confirm the purchase, the judge said. Relief flickered through my chest. But Mr. Mercer spoke immediately. Yes, Your Honor. The defendant did purchase the house. The word but hung in the air even before he said it. But the seller may not have legally owned the property at the time of sale. The courtroom reacted instantly. A wave of whispers spread through the benches. The judge leaned forward. That is a serious allegation. Yes, Mr. Mercer replied calmly. And the documents supporting it are included in the motion. The clerk handed the judge another folder. Inside were several old legal records. Yellowed paper. Faded ink. Documents dating back decades. The judge read them silently, then looked at me again. These records suggest the property trust was never dissolved. What does that mean? I asked quietly. It means the original land trust might still hold legal ownership. My neighbor stared in disbelief. That is impossible. Mr. Mercer shook his head slowly. Not impossible. My chest tightened again. If the trust still owned the land, then technically my purchase might have been invalid, which meant something terrifying. I could be living in a house I did not legally own. Your Honor, Mr. Mercer continued smoothly. If the trust remains the legal owner, the development group may negotiate directly with the trust instead. In other words, they could bypass me completely. They could purchase the land from the trust, and my house would become irrelevant. My neighbor leaned toward me. They planned this from the beginning, they whispered. I nodded slowly. Yes. Now the strategy finally made sense. The boundary dispute. The forged signature. The survey manipulation. All distractions. The real attack targeted the ownership record. Because if the trust still existed, they could take the land without ever winning the boundary case. The judge looked toward me again. Do you have evidence that the trust was dissolved? No, I admitted. Because I had never heard of it before. Why would I? The property records during my purchase showed normal ownership. No trust. No unusual conditions. Mr. Mercer stepped forward again. Your Honor, this matter requires further investigation. The judge nodded slowly. This court will need time to review the trust records. My heart sank. Time meant delay. And delay gave the developer exactly what they wanted. More time to move money. More time to push their project forward. But before the judge could speak again, a voice came from the back of the courtroom. Your Honor, that trust cannot exist anymore. Every head turned. An elderly man stood near the rear bench. I had never seen him before. Neither had my neighbor. But the judge immediately recognized him. Please identify yourself. The man stepped forward slowly. My name is Arthur Callahan. The name seemed to mean something to the judge. Mr. Callahan, were you involved with the original development? Yes. The courtroom grew silent again, because suddenly the most important witness in the entire case had appeared. I was the attorney who created the housing trust 40 years ago, he said calmly. Mr. Mercer's expression finally cracked. Just slightly, but it was enough. The judge leaned forward. Then perhaps you can explain the ownership status of this property. Mr. Callahan nodded. I can. The entire courtroom waited, because the next sentence could decide everything. The trust was dissolved 39 years ago. A ripple moved through the room. The judge frowned slightly. These documents suggest otherwise. Mr. Callahan walked toward the bench. They are incomplete. The clerk handed him the records. He flipped through them quickly, then shook his head. The final dissolution certificate is missing. Mr. Mercer stepped forward quickly. Your Honor, there is no proof such a certificate exists. Mr. Callahan looked directly at him. Oh, it exists. Where? Mr. Mercer asked sharply. Mr. Callahan smiled slightly. In my office. Silence fell again, because the meaning of that statement was obvious. If the trust had been dissolved decades ago, then the developer's entire ownership claim would collapse instantly. The judge closed the case file slowly. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning. The gavel struck the bench. The hearing ended. People began standing and whispering, but I remained seated, trying to process everything that just happened. My neighbor leaned closer. They almost stole your house. Yes. But now we have proof. Maybe, because something still bothered me. I watched Mr. Mercer carefully. Even after the hearing ended, even after the judge left, he did not look defeated. He looked thoughtful, calculating, which meant he still believed the fight was not over. And as I walked out of the courtroom, that uneasy feeling stayed with me. Because tomorrow's hearing would decide everything. But powerful people rarely accept defeat quietly, which meant something dangerous might happen before the court reopened. Something none of us were prepared for. And that night proved the fear was justified. Because when I returned home, the broken fence was gone. Not repaired. Not moved. Gone. Every board ripped out of the ground. And in its place stood a tall metal construction barrier, with a sign attached. Private development property. The metal barrier stood where my fence had been. Tall. Cold. Heavy steel panels bolted together like a wall built overnight. I stared at it for several seconds without moving. The old wooden boards that had leaned there for decades were gone. Every post removed. Every nail pulled. Even the rose bushes planted along the fence line had been crushed under tire marks. A construction sign hung from the barrier. Private development property. And no trespassing. The message felt like a challenge. Or maybe a threat. Behind me, my neighbor stepped closer, their voice barely steady. They started already. Yes. But the court has not ruled yet. That never stopped them. The developer had decided something very clear. They were not waiting for tomorrow's hearing. They were moving forward anyway. I walked closer to the barrier. Fresh welding marks still smelled of hot metal. The panels had been installed only hours earlier, which meant workers had come while I was at court, and they had not asked permission. My neighbor pointed toward the far end of the street. Two large construction trucks sat parked near the corner. Men moved around them slowly, watching, waiting. They are claiming the land already belongs to them, my neighbor whispered. Yes, but it does not. Not yet. The difference between those two words carried weight, because right now the land existed in legal uncertainty. and developers often used uncertainty as opportunity. If construction started before the final ruling, the situation could become complicated quickly. Very complicated. My neighbor looked terrified. What do we do? I studied the barrier carefully. One section contained a locked gate. Professional construction fencing. Installed fast. Installed quietly. Installed like someone expected resistance. They want to provoke a reaction, I said. What kind? If I try to remove it, they will call the police and claim you trespassed. Exactly. My neighbor shook their head slowly. This is insane. No, it is strategy. Developers understand something most people forget. Ownership battles often become psychological battles. Whoever acts more confident appears stronger. Right now they were trying to show the entire street something. Control. But something about the barrier bothered me. I walked along it slowly, studying the metal panels, the welds, the bolts. Then I saw it. A small metal plate attached near the bottom of one panel. Construction permit information. My neighbor leaned closer. What does it say? I read the numbers carefully. Then something strange happened. I smiled. What? My neighbor asked. They made a mistake. What kind of mistake? This permit number. What about it? It belongs to a different property. My neighbor blinked. You are sure? Yes. 30 years living in the same house teaches a person small details, especially when dealing with permits and repairs. The number on that plate matched the permit issued 2 months ago for a demolition project across town. Not for this street. Which meant something very simple. The developer had not obtained legal permission to install this barrier. They had rushed. Probably during the night. Probably expecting no one to notice. But mistakes happen when people rush. And this mistake mattered. Because illegal construction on disputed land can carry serious penalties. My neighbor's eyes widened. So the barrier itself is illegal. Yes. That could help us. It will help a lot. At that exact moment, a black car turned onto the street. The same sedan we saw yesterday. It stopped near the trucks. Mr. Mercer stepped out. Of course. He walked toward us calmly. The same lawyer who had smiled confidently inside the courtroom. But now his expression carried something sharper. Expectation. Good evening, he said politely. I did not return the greeting. You build a barrier on my property. That depends on tomorrow's ruling. You installed it without a permit. Mr. Mercer's smile paused for half a second, then returned. Temporary structures sometimes require flexibility. Not with the wrong permit number. His eyes moved briefly toward the metal plate. That was the moment he realized. He had not checked it. The mistake belonged to someone else on his team. But the responsibility now sat on him. That can be corrected, he said calmly. After the city sees it. My neighbor finally spoke. You are trying to intimidate us. Mr. Mercer looked at them. No, yes you are. Construction preparation is not intimidation. You destroyed my roses, I said quietly. He glanced toward the crushed plants. Collateral damage. The casual tone made something inside me harden. Those roses had been planted by someone who no longer lived. Someone who loved that yard. Someone who believed the fence protected a home. Mr. Mercer noticed the expression on my face. Then he sighed lightly. You should accept reality. What reality? The development project will proceed. Even if you lose the case. His smile returned. Especially if we lose the case. That sentence froze the air around us. My neighbor looked confused. What does that mean? Mr. Mercer adjusted his jacket. It means the project does not depend on the court ruling alone. I stepped closer. You still think the trust argument will win? Possibly. And if it fails? His eyes locked onto mine. Developers always have options. That sentence carried quiet danger. Because now it was clear. The lawsuit had only been one part of the strategy. Even if the court rejected their claims, they might still attempt other methods. Buying neighboring land. Pressuring residents. Using financial leverage. Projects like this rarely stop easily. Mr. Mercer looked back toward the trucks. Enjoy your evening. Then he walked away. The black sedan disappeared down the street again, leaving the metal barrier standing like a challenge. My neighbor looked exhausted. They are not giving up. No, what if we win tomorrow? Then this barrier comes down. And if something goes wrong? I looked at the house, at the yard, at the empty space where the fence once stood. Then I spoke quietly. They think a broken fence means a weak owner. My neighbor waited. But tomorrow they will learn something. What? That fences are not the only way to protect a home. The wind moved through the open yard again. No wooden boards creaked this time. No old post stood there, just the metal wall and the quiet house behind it. But tomorrow the courtroom would reopen. The retired attorney would bring the trust dissolution record. The forged documents would face scrutiny. The missing easement would expose the developer's manipulation, and the judge would decide the fate of everything. Yet even with all that evidence, one final twist waited. Because the developer had one last move prepared. A move that would happen inside the courtroom. A move so desperate it would shock everyone present. And it would begin with a phone call that arrived just minutes before the judge entered the room. The next morning the courtroom filled faster than the day before. Word had spread. People in small towns notice when developers and lawsuits begin circling the same street. Curious faces filled the benches. Some neighbors sat quietly near the back. Everyone waited for the same thing. The judge's decision. I sat beside my neighbor again. Their hands still trembled, though the determination in their eyes had grown stronger overnight. "Did you sleep?" they asked quietly. "Not much." "Me neither." The metal barrier still stood in my yard. The crushed roses still lay in the dirt. The image followed me into the courtroom like a shadow. My neighbor leaned closer. "Mr. Callahan is bringing the document." "Yes." "If the judge sees it, the trust argument collapses." "That is the plan." The courtroom door opened. Mr. Mercer entered with the developers behind him. Their expressions looked more serious than yesterday. Not calm, not confident. Something had changed. Mr. Callahan arrived moments later carrying the same worn leather folder. The clerk called the room to order. Everyone stood as the judge entered. The gavel struck once. "Court is now in session." Mr. Callahan stepped forward first. "Your Honor, I have located the original dissolution certificate." He handed the document to the clerk. The paper moved slowly across the bench until it reached the judge's hands. Silence filled the room. The judge studied the page carefully, then looked up. "This document confirms the housing trust was legally dissolved 39 years ago." Relief spread through my chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. Which meant the house had been transferred legally. Which meant the developer's ownership claim had just collapsed. Mr. Mercer stood. His voice sounded different now, less smooth. "Your Honor, we request verification of the document." The judge nodded slightly. "That will be handled." But the judge continued speaking before Mercer could say more. "With this certificate confirmed, the trust ownership claim has no standing." The developers behind him shifted uncomfortably. My neighbor exhaled slowly. The strongest piece of their plan had just vanished. But then something unexpected happened. Mr. Mercer's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at it briefly. The color drained from his face. A second vibration followed. Then a third. The courtroom noticed. The judge frowned slightly. "Counsel, please silence your device." "Yes, Your Honor." He quickly turned the phone off. But the damage was done. For the first time since the case began, the calm lawyer looked rattled. The judge continued. "With the trust issue resolved, the court will now review the remaining matters. The forged signature, the manipulated survey, the missing easement. Every piece of the developer's strategy now faced scrutiny." Mr. Callahan stepped forward again. "The easement corridor remains active public infrastructure," he explained. The judge nodded. "The updated survey removing it appears highly questionable." Mr. Mercer tried to speak again, but the judge raised a hand. "I have reviewed the evidence carefully." The courtroom leaned forward collectively, because everyone understood what was coming. The ruling. But before the judge could continue, the courtroom doors opened suddenly. Two officers stepped inside. One approached the judge's bench and handed over a folded document. The judge read it silently, then looked directly toward Mr. Mercer. "Counsel, it appears this case has taken an unexpected turn." Mr. Mercer looked confused. "What do you mean?" The judge lifted the paper. "This court has been notified that a federal investigation has opened regarding financial irregularities connected to the development company." The room erupted with whispers. The developers behind Mercer turned pale. The judge continued. "The investigation involves fraudulent loan applications connected to several properties in this county." The bank letter from days earlier flashed through my mind. My land listed as collateral. Without permission. Without signature. The judge looked directly at the developers. "Until this investigation is resolved, all development activity connected to this project is suspended." The words landed like thunder. Suspended. Which meant construction stopped. Funding stopped. Everything stopped. The judge turned back toward the case file. With the trust claim invalid and the boundary dispute supported by fraudulent evidence, the entire courtroom held its breath. This court rules in favor of the defendant. The gavel struck. The sound echoed across the room. And just like that, the battle that began with a broken fence was over. 3 days later, the metal barrier disappeared. City officials arrived early in the morning. Inspectors examined the permit numbers. Construction crews were ordered to remove every panel. The developers' trucks never returned. Word spread quickly across town about the federal investigation. Bank records, loan fraud, manipulated property filings. The project collapsed faster than it began, and the streets slowly returned to quiet again. I stood in the yard watching workers pull the last metal panel from the ground. The soil underneath looked damaged where the roses once grew, but the land was still mine. My neighbor walked across the yard carefully. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then they spoke quietly. "I am sorry." The words carried weight now. Not the weak apology from days earlier. A real one. "I know. I almost destroyed your home. You helped save it." They looked surprised by that. "I caused the problem." "Yes. But you also told the truth." My neighbor nodded slowly. "The investigators spoke to me yesterday. That was expected. I might face charges." "That is possible." They looked down at the dirt. "I deserve it. Maybe. But people are complicated. Mistakes do not always define a person completely." "What will you do now?" I asked. "Sell the house. And leave." "Yes." They paused before adding something else. "But before I go, I want to help you rebuild the fence." I looked at the empty space where the old boards once stood. The fence had been weak for years. Weathered. Broken. But it had still marked the line between two homes. A quiet boundary. "All right," I said. That afternoon we began working. New posts. Stronger wood. Fresh boards replacing the old ones. The work moved slowly. But every hammer strike felt like reclaiming something. Not just property. Dignity. Respect. When the final board went up, the fence looked different. Not fragile. Solid. Standing straight across the yard. My neighbor stepped back and looked at it quietly. "That fence started everything." "Yes." They nodded. "And it also finished it." The sun began setting behind the houses along the street. The quiet returned again. The kind of quiet that feels earned. My neighbor turned toward their house. "I will leave next week. Take care of yourself." "You too." They walked away slowly. The same yard where they once laughed now held silence. But something had changed. Not just the fence. Me. Because that fight had taught something simple. People sometimes believe weakness when they see broken things. A broken fence. An older homeowner. A quiet street. They assume no one will resist. But strength does not always look loud. Sometimes it stands quietly behind a fence line, refusing to move, and protecting what matters. I looked at the rebuilt fence one more time before going inside. The board stood firm, straight, unshaken, exactly the way boundaries should be. If this story made you think, remember something simple. Sometimes the people who laugh at your struggles do not understand the strength behind them. Standing up for what is yours is never easy, but silence would have cost everything. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and watch the next story waiting on your screen. Because the next one might begin with something just as small as a broken fence, but end with a truth no one expected.